Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy because we've now got the latest data for December 24. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that Russia has severely limited the amount of data that it's prepared to share with the West, but we do get some information. And today we'll go through that in detail. And the main thing that I want to talk about is inflation. And before you think, oh my God, not another video talking about inflation, I want to remind you why inflation is so important, because it's not just measuring the price of things at the stores, which obviously are going up in Russia at the moment. Inflation has a huge knock-on impact to so many other different parts of the economy, because as inflation goes up, it means that people want to get paid more, so wages go up, and that has a really big impact on companies because, generally speaking, it will reduce their profitability. But also, a rise in inflation means that the central bank will want to increase interest rates, so that increases both the cost of borrowing for consumers and companies, but also it pushes up bond yields, so it increases the cost of debt for the government. And when you have a situation where the cost of everything is going up, generally speaking, GDP starts to go down and the economy struggles. And also your currency, as inflation goes up, will tend to devalue. So that makes the cost of imports higher and therefore pushes up inflation. So this can very quickly become a vicious circle. And that's what we're seeing in Russia right now. And that's going to have a hugely detrimental impact on the long-term growth prospects for Russia, because as debt costs go up, companies and people decide that they don't want to borrow money to expand, and so the level of investment tends to go down. And again, that means that profitability falls, so GDP goes down, and this can really get out of control quite quickly. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Russia over the past 12 months. And what this chart shows is that over the past 12 months, Russia has been facing severe inflationary pressure. This time last year, inflation was running at 7.4%, which is almost double the target rate of 4% set by the Bank of Russia. So this time last year, Russia was struggling with high inflation. However, as you can see, over the last 12 months, the situation has got worse. And the most recent data for December shows that inflation is now running at 9.5%, which is the highest that it's been at any time in the last 12 months. And if we expand the scale of the chart to show the last 5 years, you can see that the current rate of inflation is the highest that's been experienced since February 23, so almost 2 years ago. And what you can also see here is that inflation has been consistently rising since May 23. Now, to put the current rate of 9.5% into perspective, this table shows the latest inflation data for the G20, which are notionally the 20 largest economies in the world. And you can see that Russia is ranked at number 3 here. The only two countries that currently have a higher rate of inflation are Argentina, which is in a state of economic turmoil at the moment. Javier Milei is trying to turn the country around, but they're coming down from a high of almost 300% inflation. And Turkey, which is also in a state of economic crisis. So Russia is coming in just behind those two. And you can see that the rate of 9.5% is more than double the official inflation rate in most of the rest of the G20. And the other point to note here is that inflation is still rising in Russia. In a lot of the other G20 countries, inflation has peaked and is now on its way back down. And that includes Argentina and Turkey. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. Something that drives me absolutely insane is spam marketing, whether it be spam emails or spam text messages, or the very worst of all, spam phone calls, where people phone you up and try to sell you things that you've got absolutely no interest in buying. Now, the reason why you're hit with so much spam these days is because of data brokers. And this is a huge industry now. Data brokers can take your data when you go online and register for a store card or buy something, and then they can sell your data onto hundreds of different databases. And those databases are then used to hit you with all of the spam. Now, the great news is that if you can find out which databases you're on, you can contact them and have your details deleted. But who's got time to be doing that? Well, the answer to that question is incogni. Once you sign up with them, they will contact the data brokers and ask for your data to be removed. And as well as cutting out all of those unsolicited phone calls and messages, it will also protect you from cybercrime and identity theft. And the fantastic news is that Joe Blog's viewers can get a 60% discount on an annual plan by clicking on the link in the description below. This chart shows the movement in food inflation in Russia over the past 12 months. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that we always like to look at what's happening with food prices, because this disproportionately impacts the poorest members of society because they're spending a larger percentage of their budget on food. And what this chart shows is that over the past 12 months, there has been an increase in food prices. This time last year, food prices were increasing year on year by just over 8%. By the summer of 24, food price increases had jumped to just under 10%. And you can see on the right-hand side of this chart that the latest data for December 24 show that year-on-year food prices are now increasing by more than 11%. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show the situation over the past 3 years, you can see that the current rate of increase of food prices is the highest that Russia has experienced since November 2022. Which was actually the year when the war in Ukraine started. So at that time, there was a lot of turmoil in Russia as a result of the fact that it was having to change its supply chains. It was buying things in from new countries and cutting its ties with the West. So you can understand why food prices were rising so rapidly back in 2022. However, the current rapid rise in food prices is more concerning because this isn't a global phenomenon. This isn't a one-time shift as a result of Russia changing its purchasing partners. This is down to what's happening in the Russian economy and also down to the fact that the ruble is now worth significantly less than it was back in November 2022. And just to highlight that point, this chart shows the movement in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble over the past 5 years. And what this shows is that in November 22, one US dollar was trading for 60 Russian rubles. Today, it's trading for 98, which represents a fall in value of more than 60% over the last 2 years or so. And as Russia is having to buy in various foodstuffs, that's one of the reasons why food prices are now rising so rapidly, because the ruble just doesn't have the same purchasing power that it did in 2022. Now, as I said at the start of today's video, one of the problems with inflation is that it has an impact directly on wages and also on the other costs that companies incur in Russia. And that's now having a detrimental impact on their profitability. This chart shows the movement in real wages in Russia, and real wages are measured after taking account of what's happening with inflation. So this data tells us whether or not people in Russia have more money at the end of their pocket in real terms after taking account of the increase in prices, or whether or not they have less. If we start off by looking at the situation this time last year, in November 23, real wages increased by 7.2%, and at that time, inflation was 7.5%. So when you add the two together, you get a total increase in wages of 14.7%, which is obviously a large increase. However, if you look at what's happening today, the situation is worse from a company point of view. Real wages in October 24, which is the latest data that's been published by Russia, increased by 7.2%. However, the official rate of inflation in October was 8.5%, which means that the actual increase in wages in October 24 was 15.7%, which is obviously significantly higher than the official rate of inflation of 9.5%, and means that Russian companies need to keep increasing their prices at an accelerating rate in order to maintain their profitability. But unfortunately for Russian businesses, that isn't happening. This chart shows the year-on-year movement in producer prices, which are also referred to as factory gate prices. So this is the price of products as they're leaving companies in Russia over the past 12 months. And what this shows is that back in November 23, producer prices were increasing by 21.9%. So that means that the companies in Russia at that time could absorb that large 14.7% increase in real wages because their sales prices were going up at a faster rate. So that meant that they could maintain their profitability as well as paying people a higher level. However, as you can see from this chart, over the past 12 months, there's been a significant reduction in the increase in producer prices. And the latest data for November 24 shows that year-on-year producer prices only increased by 3.9%. And as we just discussed, year-on-year wages rose in October by 15.7%. So what that means is that if you're having to pay your people more than 15% more, but you're only increasing your prices by around 4%, you're taking a cut in terms of your profitability. You're absorbing that higher cost of people because you're not passing it on in the form of higher prices. So clearly that's bad news for Russian businesses. And if you follow the channel, you'll be aware that one of the reasons why wages are rising so rapidly in Russia right now is because the Kremlin is employing lots of different companies to support the war effort. They're being sponsored, they're being told by the Kremlin to produce things and being given guaranteed revenue. And those companies have been running around hiring as many people as they can because the more stuff they produce, the more they get paid, guaranteed revenue. And that's forced up wages across the board in Russia. And normal companies are suffering as a result of that because they're having to offer higher wages, almost 16% higher year on year. However, they're not able to pass on that increasing cost in terms of higher sales prices. Now, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, one of the problems with rising inflation is that the central bank will want to tackle it by increasing interest rates, and that therefore increases the cost of both borrowing for companies and consumers, but also government debt. This chart shows the movement in the official interest rate in Russia over the past 3 years. And what this shows is that in the summer of 23, interest rates were sitting at 7.5%, which seems like a high level, but actually was lower than the rate of interest before the war in Ukraine started. However, as you can also see, over the past 18 months, the Russian central bank has increased interest rates on 8 separate occasions to the current level of 21%. Now, the reason why the Bank of Russia have increased interest rates so rapidly is because they're trying to tame inflation. By increasing the cost of debt, it discourages people from taking on more borrowing. Therefore, the logic says that you'll have less money to spend, and therefore demand will go down, and ultimately prices will start going down. So that's the main driver why the Bank of Russia is doing it. But the problem that it causes in the economy is that increasing the cost of debt discourages both consumers and companies from taking on more debt. Therefore, they will invest less, and the economy starts to slow down. And if we compare the current interest rate in Russia with the rest of the G20, you can see that there are only 2 economies that have a higher rate of inflation, not surprisingly. Turkey, which is currently at 45%, and Argentina at 32%. And the rate of 21% in Russia is 4 or 5 times higher than the vast majority of the G20. And that really indicates just how serious the problems in Russia are right now. The Bank of Russia would not want to set the interest rate at 21% if it didn't have to, but unfortunately needs must. And if we look at this chart, it shows the yield on Russian 10-year government bonds over the past 5 years. And what this shows is that at the end of 2021, before the war in Ukraine started, the yield on Russian 10-year bonds was sitting at around 8.5%. However, as you can see from the right-hand side of this chart, the yield today is now sitting at just under 16%. So the yield on Russian 10-year bonds has almost doubled over the past 3 years, and that means that the cost of Russian government debt has doubled over the same period. In terms of assessing the impact of the rise in inflation and the increase in interest rates on the Russian economy, let's have a look at what's been happening with GDP. This chart shows the year-on-year movement in GDP, which is recorded quarterly in Russia over the past 3 years. And firstly here, it's worth having a look at the direct impact of the invasion of Ukraine on Russia's GDP. In the fourth quarter of 2021, which was the year before the war started, the year-on-year increase in GDP was 5%. However, as you can see, that growth was quickly eradicated following the start of the war and the imposition of the sanctions. And by the second quarter of 2022, year on year, the Russian economy had contracted by 4.5%. Now, as Russia converted itself to a wartime economy, the situation started to improve, and we've talked a lot on the channel about how that's happened. And by the first quarter of 2024, the year-on-year increase in GDP was 5.4%. However, as you can see, over the past 6 months, the situation has deteriorated. In the second quarter of 24, the GDP growth fell to 4.1%, and in the third quarter, which is the latest data that's been published, it's fallen to 3.1%. And as you can see, there is a clear downward trend here, which is partly as a result of the rising inflation and rising interest rates. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's important to keep on top of what's happening in the Russian economy. And what we've seen from today's data is that inflation is now rising at its fastest rate since February 2023, so almost 2 years. And interest rates are at their highest level ever in Russia. Russia has never had interest rates at this level before. And as we've discussed in today's video, the combination of rising prices and high interest rates is really bad news for the economy and particularly for Russian businesses. And as we've seen from the wages data, wages in Russia are now out of control. They're rising by almost 16% year on year because of the fact that the Kremlin is sponsoring lots of businesses. So those businesses don't have to worry about high wages because they're getting guaranteed income directly from the state. But unfortunately, that's having a detrimental impact on all of the other companies in Russia that do have to worry about their wages. And what those businesses are seeing is that they're having to absorb those cost increases. The factory gate prices are not rising anywhere near as much as wages. So the people, the workers in Russia are benefiting, but the companies are suffering and they're seeing their profitability falling. And that's now starting to feed through into GDP. And what we've also seen in today's video is the cost of borrowing for the Russian government is now up to almost 16%. And that is an extremely high level. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that I've posted videos recently talking about the UK increase in bond yields. And that's sitting at around 5%. And that's seen as being extremely high. Obviously, 16% is more than 3 times that level. So that really indicates all the problems that are now starting to surface in the Russian economy. And this really comes back to the fact that Russia is having to pay more for its imports because the value of the ruble is sitting at a much lower level today than it was before the war in Ukraine started. It was running, roughly speaking, on average at around 75 to $1. It's now sitting at around 100. So obviously that's a huge increase. And so everything that Russia imports is now proportionately more expensive. And when you add on top what's happening with wages and the increase in food prices, all of this is a recipe for disaster and is one of the reasons why President Putin is now considering some sort of trade peace deal, because this can't continue. If this goes on for the next 12 to 18 to 24 months in Russia, the Russian economy is going to continue suffering, GDP is going to continue falling, and there's going to be significant issues for a lot of businesses. And if you follow the channel, you know I recently posted a video talking about the fact that a lot of the CEOs of the big businesses in Russia are complaining about the 21% interest rate because they can't borrow to expand their businesses. In normal situations, companies would take on debt to invest into expanding, maybe building new premises or taking on more stock, working capital, those sort of things. You don't want to do that when it's costing you 21% because if your profit margin isn't more than 21%, you're actually going to get a poor return on that investment. So a lot of businesses are sitting on their hands at the moment in Russia, and Russian consumers are also considering leaving money in the bank because they're getting paid 21% interest. So that encourages people to stop spending. And the problem with that is that it has a detrimental impact on the economy. So the overall summary of today's video is that the rapid rise in prices that we're seeing in Russia right now is hurting the Russian economy, it's hurting Russian businesses, it's pushed up the cost of borrowing for people, companies and the state in Russia, and all of this is really bad news for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.